Law enforcement officers are trained to expect the unexpected, but some calls go beyond the realm of logic and into the chilling unknown. Tonight, we're diving into 4 terrifying encounters from the brave men and women behind the badge. Stories where the paranormal collided with reality. From haunted homes to sinister rituals and chilling confrontations in the dead of night, these officers faced more than just danger. They faced the unexplainable. So dim the lights, lock your doors, and prepare to hear the untold stories of the supernatural, direct from the front lines. Welcome to LV Scary Stories. Story number 1. Night shifts in our town are rarely quiet, but that night was different. Dispatch had just called in a situation involving Joseph, a name I knew all too well. Joseph was one of those kids who seemed to live for chaos. Every cop in the department had dealt with him at some point. Shoplifting, vandalism, fights at school. If there was trouble, Joseph wasn't far behind. But this time, it was different. Unit 412, respond to a 1096 on Maple Drive. The radio crackled. Joseph's family called in. He's acting violent, smashed a window with his hands and fled the scene. Suspect is bleeding and heading northbound on foot. I sighed and turned my cruiser toward Maple Drive. Joseph was a handful, but there was something about him that always felt off. He hated being called Joseph. Anytime someone used his real name, he'd snap, yelling, "I'm not Joseph, I'm Nathan." No one understood why. Maybe it was his way of rebelling, but tonight, I was about to find out the truth. When I arrived at the scene, the family was shaken. His mother was in tears, clutching a blood-stained towel. He just went crazy, she stammered. He punched right through the window, his hands were bleeding so much, and then he just ran. We couldn't stop him. I radioed for backup and began canvassing the area. It didn't take long to pick up a trail, smears of blood on the sidewalk leading north. My gut tightened as I realized where the trail was heading, the cemetery. It was 3 blocks away, sprawling and ancient, with towering oaks that cast shadows like skeletal fingers in the moonlight. Most locals avoided the place at night, claiming it had an unsettling vibe. I pulled up to the entrance, flashlight in hand, and followed the trail. The air grew colder the farther I went, and the silence was oppressive, broken only by the crunch of my boots on the gravel path. That's when I saw him. Joseph was sprawled on the ground, motionless on top of a grave. His hands were coated in blood, his face pale and slack, like he'd passed out mid. I approached cautiously, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. "Joseph!" I called out, but there was no response. When I got closer, my flashlight beam landed on the headstone beneath him. My breath caught in my throat. Nathan, 19641-976. The name sent a chill down my spine. I crouched down, placing 2 fingers on Joseph's neck to check for a pulse. It was there, faint but steady. I radioed for medical assistance, but as I waited, I couldn't stop staring at the grave. Who was Nathan? Joseph began to stir, his head lolling to the side. His eyes fluttered open, and when he looked at me, I felt an icy wave of dread. His gaze wasn't Joseph's. It was sharp, piercing, almost angry. "You shouldn't have come here," he muttered, his voice low and strained. "Joseph, it's okay," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "We're going to get you help." His lips curled into a chilling smile, but it wasn't the mischievous grin I was used to seeing. It was something darker, something that didn't belong on a teenager's face. "I'm not Joseph," he whispered. Before I could respond, his body went limp again, as if someone had flipped a switch. The eerie silence of the cemetery pressed down on me, and for a moment I swore I heard faint laughter, childlike, echoing through the night. When backup arrived, we moved Joseph off the grave and onto a stretcher. Joseph was then taken to the hospital. I have no idea what the connection is between Joseph and that cemetery or that grave, but that was one of the creepiest things I've ever encountered as a police officer. Story I've seen things on the job that would make most people lose sleep for weeks, but nothing haunts me like the call we responded to 2 years ago. It started like any other shift. The radio crackled and dispatch came through with a 1090. A neighbor reported hearing screams from the apartment next door. A kid's voice, they said. The man who lived there was strange. He kept to himself, rarely spoke, but neighbors often saw him carrying strange items into his apartment. Animal bones, jars filled with unidentifiable liquids. We didn't waste time. My partner and I arrived at the scene, lights flashing, and heard the muffled cries of a child coming from inside. After pounding on the door and announcing ourselves, the man finally opened up. He was calm, too calm for someone who'd just been accused of kidnapping a kid. Behind him, I could see the boy, about 6 or 7 years old, trembling in the corner. "Step outside, sir," I said, my hand resting on my holstered weapon. He gave a chilling smile and said, "Of course, officer. No trouble here." He turned and released the boy, who bolted past us, sobbing. Relief washed over me, but it didn't last. As soon as the boy was safe, the man turned back to us, holding something in his hand. A doll, handmade, its face crudely stitched with tufts of black thread for hair. Before I could process what he was doing, he took 2 long needles and jammed them into the doll's chest. "Liver and lung," he said softly, his voice dripping with malice. "Drop it," I barked, raising my weapon. "Hands where I can see them." But he didn't comply. Instead, his hand moved toward his pocket, and my instincts kicked in. I fired 1 shot, center mass, hitting his shoulder. He crumpled to the floor. Ground clutching his arm as it went limp, we moved in to secure him, handcuffing him as he writhed on the floor. He didn't scream, didn't beg. Instead, he looked directly at me with those hollow, dark eyes and hissed, "Someone you love will suffer this pain." I'll admit, it rattled me, but I pushed it aside. People say crazy things when they're caught. We booked him, and I thought that was the end of it. But life has a cruel way of circling back. 2 years later, I came home from work to find my wife Emily, pale and weak, clutching her chest. After endless tests, the doctors confirmed what I prayed they wouldn't: breast cancer, already advanced. It had metastasized to her liver and lung. I couldn't help but think back to that night. His words echoed in my mind. "Someone you love will suffer this pain." We fought it together. Chemo, surgeries, endless nights in the hospital. She was a warrior, but the disease was relentless. Eventually, Emily told me she wanted to go to Hawaii, where we'd gotten engaged. She wanted to see the beach one last time, to feel the sun and hear the waves. I booked the flight and we left for Maui. She was frail, but she smiled the whole way, holding my hand as we talked about the life we'd built together. Somewhere over the Pacific, the plane hit turbulence. I reached for Emily's hand to reassure her, but her grip didn't tighten like it usually did. I glanced over and realized she wasn't responding. Her breathing had stopped, her face peaceful as if she had simply fallen asleep. I didn't make a scene. I couldn't bear the thought of strangers staring at her. I wrapped my arm around her and shielded her face, pretending she was asleep. The rest of the flight was a blur. When we landed, I told the flight crew. They were kind, discreet, and understanding. We buried Emily in Maui, beneath a tree overlooking the ocean, just as she would have wanted. But even as I said goodbye, I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't just cancer that took her. It was him, the man with the doll. Now, every night, I wake up in a cold sweat, replaying that moment in my head. The shot I fired, his curse, and the life I lost. I've tried to convince myself it's just coincidence, that curses aren't real, but deep down, I know better. Some nights, when the wind howls outside, I swear I can hear his voice whispering, "Liver and lung." Story number 3. Halloween night always brings its fair share of trouble. Underage drinking, pranksters, and the occasional scare that goes too far. But this call was different. It came in around 9:45 p.m. 911, what's your emergency? A frantic voice on the other end. It's the corn maze off County Road 17. Someone's hurt bad. A woman in one of the buildings. She's bleeding. When we arrived at the scene, the corn maze was packed. The air smelled of popcorn and damp hay, with a background hum of laughter and screams from people enjoying the scares. But near the entrance to the old bathroom building, the mood was entirely different. A crowd had gathered, their faces pale and eyes wide with fear. "Out of the way!" I shouted as I pushed through. My flashlight cut through the dimly lit room, landing on the woman everyone called Bloody Mary. She was crumpled on the filthy tile floor, her costume soaked with real blood this time. Her breaths were shallow, her hands pressed against her stomach. 4 stab wounds, one just below her ribs, another near her collarbone, and 2 on her left side. "Help's coming," I told her, trying to keep her calm while applying pressure to the worst wound. "Stay with me." Her lips trembled as she whispered, "He found me." It wasn't the kind of cryptic line you want to hear in a situation like this. Paramedics arrived moments later, whisking her away to the hospital. She was lucky. If we'd been called even 5 minutes later, she might not have made it. But the real work started after she left. As we cleared the scene, one of the maze employees approached me, a kid, probably no older than 19, his face pale as a ghost. "Officer," he stammered, "there was a guy earlier tonight. He didn't come with anyone, just walked into the maze by himself. He wasn't right." "What do you mean?" I asked, pulling out my notepad. "Well, he kept asking where Bloody Mary was. Said he'd heard about her and wanted to see her for himself. He wasn't joking around, though. He seemed intense." The employee led us to the building's entrance, where they'd set up a creepy handwritten sign, "Bloody Mary lives here." It was meant to be part of the maze experience. A few witnesses confirmed seeing a man who fit the description, a wiry build, dressed in a gray hoodie, with his face partially hidden. "Oh, didn't say much," one of them said. But I remember his eyes. They were dead, like he wasn't really there." The victim, whose name was Lauren, came through surgery fine and was stable enough to talk the next day. She confirmed what I'd started to piece together. The man was her ex-boyfriend. His name was Ethan, and they'd broken up over a year ago. Lauren said he had a temper and refused to accept that the relationship was over. She moved towns to get away from him, but he found her. The job at the maze was supposed to be her fresh start, a way to have fun and escape the shadows of her past. It didn't take long to track him down. A bolo on his vehicle led to his arrest in a motel 2 towns over. When we brought him in, he didn't resist. He sat in the interrogation room, staring at the wall, unblinking, as if he wasn't even in the same reality as the rest of us. "You scared her," I said, trying to provoke some kind of reaction. "Hunted her down. And for what? To stab her in a Halloween maze?" His lips curled into the faintest smile. "She belonged to me," he muttered, almost too soft to hear. "Ethan was charged with attempted murder, among other things. As far as I'm concerned, he's exactly where he belongs, behind bars. But the memory of that night sticks with me. Maybe it's the eerie setting or the fact that the line between fake scares and real ones blurred so disturbingly. Or maybe it's Lauren's words echoing in my mind. He found me. Story number 4. Night shifts are usually uneventful in our little town. Most nights, it's just me cruising empty streets, pulling over the occasional speeder, or dealing with a noise complaint. But one night changed everything for me, and to this day, I still can't explain what happened. It was just past 2:30 a.m. when dispatch crackled over the radio. "We've got a report of strange activity at the old house on 16th Street. The caller says they saw lights and heard voices. Check it out when you're able." 16th Street. I knew the place. Everyone did. The old house had been abandoned for decades, ever since the family that lived there vanished without a trace. Kids dared each other to spend the night there, and locals swore it was haunted. I rolled my eyes. Probably just teenagers looking for a cheap thrill. When I arrived, the street was eerily quiet. The house stood at the end of the block, its dark silhouette looming like a shadow against the moonlit sky. The windows were shattered, the roof sagging, and the yard was overgrown with weeds. I parked my patrol car and radioed in. "This is Unit 4212. I'm on scene at 16th Street, investigating now." I stepped out into the cold night, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The gate creaked loudly as I pushed it open, the sound sending a shiver down my spine. As I approached the front door, I couldn't shake the feeling that the air was different, heavy, oppressive, like walking into the heart of a storm. The door was slightly ajar, so I nudged it open with my boot. "Well, CPD," I called out, my voice echoing through the house. There was no response. The first floor was what I expected. Dusty furniture, peeling wallpaper, and debris scattered everywhere. In the living room, I found evidence of a recent visit: beer cans, candy wrappers, and a sleeping bag. "Teenagers?" I muttered under my breath. I was about to leave when I heard it, a faint whisper from upstairs. I froze. It wasn't the sound of one person talking. It was more like multiple voices layered on top of each other, speaking in a language I couldn't recognize. "Hello?" I called out, my hand instinctively resting on my holstered weapon. No answer, just the whispers, growing louder. I climbed the stairs slowly, each step creaking beneath my boots. At the top, the whispering stopped. The hallway stretched before me, dark and silent, with all the doors closed except for one at the far end. From that room, a faint light flickered, cold and unnatural. My pulse quickened as I approached. The temperature dropped sharply, my breath puffing out in white clouds. I reached the doorway and shone my flashlight inside. The room was empty except for an old cracked mirror leaning against the far wall. I glanced into the mirror and froze. In the reflection, a shadowy figure dashed behind me, moving from one side of the door to the other. My heart pounded as I spun around, stepping back into the hallway, but there was nothing there. "We CPD, hello?" I called out again, my voice trembling slightly. After clearing the second floor and finding nothing else, I descended the stairs. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't wanted there. The sensation grew stronger with every passing moment, an oppressive urge that made my stomach turn. I can't explain it, but it felt like the house itself was pushing me out. Back outside, I stood by my car, staring at the house's dark, crumbling facade. Questions swirled in my mind. Why did the family that used to live there leave so suddenly? What's really inside that house? I didn't have any answers. For weeks afterward, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me. At home, I'd catch glimpses of movement out of the corner of my eye, or hear faint knocks on the windows and doors late at night. Then there was the smell, that same cold, metallic stench from the house. One night, while taking the trash out, I froze. The smell was stronger than ever, and I felt that same oppressive weight pressing down on me, like unseen eyes boring into my back. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, but deep down I knew better. Whatever I encountered in that house wasn't finished with me. It followed me home. The disturbances continued for months until I finally moved out of that little town to a city where my son is attending college. Since then, the knocks, the smells, and the feeling of being watched have stopped. But I'll never forget what happened on 16th Street that night, or the thing I saw in the mirror. That's all for this video. Thank you for making it all the way through and supporting my stories. Have a wonderful day or night. End quote. By Luke Andrews, Lightsaber Blurb.